Well, hello everybody. I'm Kathy Blume. This is Mark Nash, and welcome to Heady, Vermont's Mental Health Monday. We felt like, given the unprecedented and urgent nature of the crisis of a global pandemic and the challenge of dealing with it on a psycho-spiritual and emotional level, it would be a great idea to be able to offer up a little more proactive mental health support to our community. And as it happens, my awesome husband here, Mark Nash, is a psychotherapist, and in his former life was a theater maker, and so he, I feel like, has one of the deepest understandings of human experience and the internal human landscape of almost anyone I know. And why should I be the only one who gets to benefit from his wisdom and his patience? So Mark has agreed to join us on Mondays to talk about how to manage the whole situation. Before we get into that, I have a few updates, which you most likely have heard, but I thought I'd share anyway. So here in Vermont, Governor Phil Scott has issued stay-at-home. It's not an order, it's more of an urgent suggestion. He trusts in the inherent good nature of Vermonters to do the right thing by each other, although I've heard anecdotal evidence from friends that they've seen people just out and about doing their thing. So stay home, and new evidence suggests that wearing a mask is actually a good idea, even if it's an improvised mask. Barriers are better than nothing. So stay home unless you absolutely have to, wear a mask, and wash your hands like a maniac, because those things we know are important. The medical cannabis dispensaries have been declared essential businesses. Many of them have shifted their hours of operation and their ordering protocols. I know some of the dispensaries are just taking phone orders, and they want you to pay by check because they don't want to handle cash. So check in with your local dispensary's website to find out exactly what they're doing. Want to give a shout out to Vermont Senate President Pro Tem Tim Ashe, who has been giving great daily updates on his Facebook page every afternoon live at 5:30. So check in with what Tim's doing. He's really giving some fantastic information and being one of those voices of grounded adult in the room leadership that we definitely need right now. There are definitely some federal and state economic relief bills coming along, although it's certainly not a totally equitable situation. Cannabis businesses are mostly not eligible for any money coming from the feds, even though Vermont, like many states, have designated medical cannabis dispensaries as essential businesses. And people who still have jobs on the front lines, particularly minimum wage workers, are going to get less than folks on unemployment. And in many cases, they don't have protective gear. And I know that a lot of the people who are working at City Market have been advocating for that. So this is a great cause if you want to if you're sitting on the couch and you want to engage a little bit, making sure that the people on the front lines are as well taken care of as possible is a really important thing to do. Also, there's a big push for rent and mortgage freeze right now, which is also a great idea. Advocate for that. And like I said, there's new research out there that says wearing masks is a good idea. It's not perfect, but it'll help, and anything that helps is worth pursuing. On the home front, Mark and I have been home for a couple of weeks now, and we're doing pretty well. Mark is doing most of the going out into the world work, which shopping, things like that, for which I'm incredibly grateful. And I have to confess that this has been an interesting moment for me, because I am normally the type to get out there and organize and lead charges and raise flags and do as much as humanly possible. Either, volunteer or organize my own thing. But as it happens, a few years ago, I had my own health crisis, which left me, I think, less robust than I was in the past and more guarding of my health. And while I am not physically, technically in a high-risk category at all, having been intubated once already, while it saved my life, it is also not an experience that I would want to run the risk of repeating, if at all possible. So I have definitely had a sense of a greater vulnerability than I would have had in the past, which is a weird thing to experience. And yet I know that I am profoundly privileged to be able to hide out this much in, as you can see, a lovely environment with an awesome human being. And all of that privilege could easily send me into the first topic that I want to talk about today with Mark, which is guilt. And I think guilt can come in a number of flavors or from a number of directions. You can be guilt around what I'm doing or what I'm not doing or what someone else is doing or not doing, and seeing all the inequity and the unfairness out there. And guilt is an incredibly challenging emotion to manage. So when someone comes to you and lays guilt on the table, what do you do with that?
First, I think it's useful to distinguish between feelings of guilt and feelings of empathy. When we see something that we perceive as deeply problematic, and we see that we aren't able to, or have chosen not to, influence that thing, we'll feel uncomfortable. That discomfort may be empathy in terms of just caring about seeing other people struggling, seeing other people in pain. Guilt we usually define as an understanding that we personally are doing something wrong. And by wrong, I don't mean according to somebody else's opinion or according to societal opinions, but are we failing to uphold our own core values? Are we failing to act in alignment with our own integrity? And if we aren't, then guilt is a nice little sort of reminder to shift our behavior. The problem is when we're in isolation, we may not be able to. It might not be physically or socially or ethically appropriate to do those things that would be in alignment with our core values. And so there's a tension between what we would do if we could and our inability to do that. And that can lead to feelings of guilt. But again, I would suggest that we note those, but let them go pretty quickly, because blaming and shaming ourselves for things that are out of our control only adds to our own emotional discomfort and doesn't do anything to help the people that we're feeling bad for.
So letting something go is an easy thing to say and an awfully difficult thing to do. What's the practice behind, okay, I'm feeling guilty about whatever it might be. How do I let it go?
It helps to move from the emotional brain to the rational brain. And the emotional brain is telling you, I'm not doing as much as I could or should. I need to do more. And since I'm not, I feel bad about it. The rational brain can help you by deepening your understanding of what is in your control and what is not, what's possible and what's not, and shift your thinking to an understanding that you are in fact doing your best under the current circumstances, and treating yourself with compassion, treating yourself with patience, treating yourself with understanding, with gentleness. And I know that that sometimes feels like it's letting ourselves off the hook, that somehow it is incumbent upon us to feel as crappy as possible about our inability to do more, or to feel crappy about our privilege or our comfort while other people are suffering. And I'm suggesting that feeling crappy doesn't really help anyone. Understanding what's possible, acting on what's possible, great, but then you have to say, there are things that are out of my control, and I just have to learn to sit with that discomfort.
And that discomfort can also border on fear, too. If there are things that are out of your control, things that are threatening, in this case, things that are invisible that are threatening, and we go into a fear place, and our limbic system gets revved up. And we saw a great post on Twitter where someone was talking about why people might be feeling more tired right now, even though they're staying home, they're not doing as much as they would normally do. And she said it's a trauma response. You can't fight the virus actively. So, when you're in fear, it's fight, flight, or freeze. All we can do is freeze, and your body might shut down. And it's okay to have a coping strategy that allows you to tune things out for a little bit, because it's the potentially only response you might have in that moment. Now, maybe when your system calms down a little bit, you can do a little investigating and think you could sew masks, or you could sign petitions, or you can call and make sure your friends are okay, or that the least in your community are being cared for. But, I think part of the challenge, too, is when we're in that heightened response, it's very difficult to engage from any kind of rational place.
Yeah, we're doers. We want to fix things. We want to make things better. We are compassionate, empathetic people. We don't want to see people suffering. We want to protect ourselves and our loved ones. We want to be able to fend off these invisible threats. And when the only thing we can do is sit at home, that can be incredibly frustrating to our urge to do more. But ultimately, we have to make peace with that.
I think there's another arc of things that we were looking forward to, the disappointment of that not happening, the fear of our greatest plans for our life going awry. I'm sure a lot of people are like, okay, there goes my retirement. And the grief at all the things that we are losing either temporarily or long-term. When people close to us might die, or people we admire might die. The singer-songwriter John Prine just died, or the playwright Terrence McNally just died. And Terrence McNally, was it? Yeah. And the loss of those people that we admire also feels like a diminishment. It feels like, and we know, at least in Vermont, we haven't even hit the peak yet. In most places, we haven't hit the peak of the curve, so we don't even know it's coming. And so there's that sort of anticipatory grief about what we might lose. Grief is a very enervating and debilitating thing, or can be. And is there a way to prepare for that? Or how, like when we're in the thick of it, what do we do with it?
Feel it. Loss is real. We cannot avoid the fact that we are experiencing great loss. We're experiencing, as you said, potentially the loss of things as, at this point, relatively minor as going out to dinner or a vacation that was planned. And it goes up the scale to things like our jobs or our retirement or our health or the health and life of loved ones. And we can imagine all kinds of greater societal losses. Those things are real, and the appropriate response and the human response is sadness, grief, mourning, and we can't run away from that. We can't avoid it. We can't deny it. And so, in fact, as much as it can be enervating, oddly enough, resisting it can be even more detrimental. And my own personal experience is that because I work with clients who are experiencing a lot of loss, and I read a lot about all of the loss that's going on all over the world, I am sometimes hit with waves of grief and an impulse to cry shows up. And it is not comfortable to cry, but I find that it is really helpful to let it go. There's actually some physiological response to tears and the act of crying that is really helpful emotionally. And so don't let it build up. Don't try and suppress it. Go ahead and feel it and express it in whatever way you can. And expressing it through tears or through sleep or just sitting quietly is much more helpful than it coming out in other ways, possibly aggression, frustration, anger, anxiety. And that's just going to be our reality for a while, is we're going to have to feel that really difficult feeling.
Yeah, I had a rough weekend. There was a lot of, I tend to be, I store it up and then I let it go in one big whoosh, and that was my weekend. But I was talking to a friend of mine in Los Angeles, and they're about a week and a half ahead of the narrative from where we are. And she said that's what she sees in a lot of her friends. Like, they do okay for a few days, and then they do a deep dive into their emotional morass, but then they come out again and they're able to re-engage. And I think, again, also trusting that whatever you're feeling is temporary. It's not going to go on forever.
That's right.
And you will come out the other side.
Yeah.
And any grief we've all experienced in our lives, it does transform. And a friend of mine once said to me, there's living in grief and there's living with it. And that's a very different dynamic.
It's also, a slight reframe with grief. As much as we wish that we weren't experiencing it, it is a sign of love. It is an expression of the feelings of loss for those things that we hold especially dear. And so, again, we can wish that it weren't so, but it ultimately is an essential part of our humanity.
So people are going to be turning to each other, hopefully, for support, or professionals. I would think one of the biggest tricks, though, when people are coming to you with a big emotional burden, is how not to take on their stuff. And actually, when Mark was considering whether or not to become a psychotherapist, one of his biggest concerns was that he would take on the emotional load of all of his clients, which would not be a terribly sustainable practice. So how do you not take on someone else's stuff? How do you sit with someone in the wetness and stickiness of what they're going through and not get it all over you?
I don't know. It's a subtle practice, and it is a practice. It isn't something.
You can't just spray coat yourself and.
No, well, you kind of can, in the sense that you can sort of. Some people can sort of decide to shut off their empathy and shut off their compassion and not let themselves feel. And
can we actually back up a second, because there's a difference between empathy and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And you can care for someone without going through their experience.
That's right.
Kind of like if a 2-year-old is having a tantrum, you're not going to go and have a tantrum with them. You're going to provide the space for them to have their experience without needing it to be your own experience.
That's right. Well, and there's a great example. If we can do that with a 2-year-old, we can probably do that with an adult, a friend, or a loved one. And while this may sound a little woo-woo, it has to do with how much you choose to open your heart to another person and to an emotional experience. And there are times when we've got the energy to be fully open and fully present. That word comes up a lot. What does it mean to be present? And it means to be right there with the other person, fully experiencing their pain in that moment. And there are times when we might just not have the energy to do that, and that we need to preserve some of that for ourselves. And so we distance ourselves from it a little bit. Not entirely. The people who have completely shut themselves off forever, we call those people sociopaths. They really don't care about what happens to other people, and it's highly unlikely that we will go that far. But there are times when we can just say, yeah, I get what you're feeling, and internally we're saying, but I need to preserve a little bit of my heart for myself. And by the way, that works on the larger scale too. When we're reading the news, there is a tendency to get overwhelmed with all of the bad stuff out there and feel into the feelings of the struggling nurses and doctors in New York or in Italy who are making life or death decisions, the older people who are scared and alone, and we can really easily go right there into that emotional place with them. And if we did that 24/7, we wouldn't be able to survive. And so, I've talked in the past about limiting our media diet, but even when we are engaging in the limited amount that we are accessing, you have to look at it sometimes a little clinically and with a little bit of an objective distance, and not go there, not go on the emotional ride. It's the same way as if sometimes if you're watching a movie at home alone, you totally put yourself into it. If you're watching a movie on an airplane, you're probably gonna find a way to hold it back a little bit because you probably don't want to start crying at the moment in, I don't know, what's one of those moments in a movie?
Right.
When you're stuck in the middle seat between two people who are, playing solitaire on their laptops, and so you find a way to manage your emotional response to something, and that's what is helpful to do during times of strong emotional experiences.
And it doesn't mean you don't care.
It doesn't. That's the thing. It doesn't mean you don't care. It's the same also to think about all of the people who may have it worse than we do, and that somehow our pain doesn't matter because we aren't suffering as much as other people. Comparing pain doesn't help, and it's kind of irrelevant. Our pain is just as real. We don't have to stack it up against someone else's pain. So yeah, be there for people, be there, experience it emotionally, but do it wisely.
It occurs to me too, I've done a lot of work in the climate movement, and it's always helpful to have language to articulate what you're experiencing, because it makes it feel more real, and it's also more validating. And there's an Australian psychologist named Glenn Albrecht who coined the term solastalgia, and that is nostalgia for the place where you are, because the ground is shifting under your feet and things are changing rapidly. And I think that's the kind of thing where if we didn't have a word to define it, we wouldn't even know exactly what we were experiencing. And I think we're kind of all experiencing a form of solastalgia right now, where things are changing. And as a friend of mine, who's also a psychotherapist, name is Brian Litzenberger, he's in Massachusetts, he's fabulous. He said, we flew into this overnight, and it takes a long time to adjust to new normals. And he also noted that our lives before were hopefully meeting most of our emotional needs, and we lost some of those things, but we didn't lose the needs. And so we need to find new structures and systems that help us get those needs met. And just because it's the right thing to isolate yourself at home doesn't mean you don't have need for social contact. And you don't have to deny that need just because being by yourself is the right thing to do.
You may not even be aware that you had those needs because they were being met so effortlessly. But one of the practices in times of isolation is to notice when you're feeling uncomfortable and may not know why. And you have to sort of look deep inside yourself and say, okay, what is this physical experience? What is the emotion I'm feeling around it? And can I articulate with my rational mind what it is that's missing, or what it is that would help me to feel better in this moment?
And as a therapist, if someone came to you with stuff, that would be a practice that you would help them learn. Now that's mindfulness, that's CBT.
No, it's mindfulness practice primarily. It's mindfulness has three main components. One is awareness, and it's awareness of the physical world around us, but it's especially awareness of what's happening internally, both our physiological responses, our emotional responses, and our intellectual responses, our thought patterns. And to be able to look at all of those objectively, see which ones are useful, see which ones we can impact, see which ones we just have to sit with and let them pass.
And that's, again, an easy thing to articulate, takes a lot of practice.
It takes constant practice.
To be able to do. So we're at about 24 minutes here. It seems like a good time to wrap up, even though we could go on for hours. Once again, the value of engaging with a professional if you're struggling has to do with...
Well, when we're talking to our friends and family members about our emotional life, there can be a sense of responsibility of not wanting to overwhelm them, or needing to make sure that they have room then to share their stuff, which then we feel like we need to engage with fully. When you're talking with a professional, it's just about you. You don't have to ask how your therapist is doing in the pandemic. You don't have to listen to their own pain. They have their own therapist for that, or their own partners. it gets to be all about you. It gets to be about you really letting go of any sense of responsibility for anyone else other than yourself. And so it can be an incredibly liberating and releasing experience.
And best way to find someone to work with?
Psychologytoday.com. And you type in your zip code or your city, and it'll give you a long list, and then you just go hunting through as to who seems like a good fit. And by the way, finding a good therapist might take a few tries. It's like any relationship. It needs to be a good fit.
You can date around for a while first.
You often have to date around, although sometimes you'll find somebody right off the bat. All psychotherapists are doing telehealth now. All insurances are paying for telehealth. If you don't have insurance, most therapists are offering a sliding scale with greatly reduced rates.
Great. And any last pearl of wisdom that you want to leave folks with?
This is going to be hard. And it's a great opportunity to learn to sit with difficult feelings without feeling a need to do anything about them, make them go away, because they will pass, they will ebb and flow.
All right. So that is Mental Health Monday for today, March 30th. And if you have any questions, you can email Heady Vermont, info@headyvermont.com. You can email Mark if you have questions at
marknashvt@gmail.com.
And marknashvt.com is also his website. And please don't ever hesitate to reach out for help, because you're not alone, even if you feel alone. And there are tools and people out there to help manage all this stuff. So, namaste, Om Shanti, L'chaim, deep blessings upon you all, and we will get through this together and hopefully come out more evolved, just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit on the other side. All right, have a great day, everybody.